David Makin. I'm an associate professor at Washington State University. I also serve as the undergraduate director in my department, which is Criminology and Criminal Justice. And I guess most central to our conversation here, I'm the director of the Complex Social Interactions Lab at Washington State University. So by and large, and I certainly will talk a little bit more about this, the purpose of the lab is really to help police departments make sense, what we would consider to kind of operationalize their footage, right? So you figure most departments amass just tremendous repositories of footage, and they don't do anything with it. They don't review it. Very rarely is it used for evidentiary purposes. In a criminal complaint or criminal case, it just kind of sits there, and then eventually it's deleted because it no longer needs to be retained. We kind of call it falls off the water cliff, right? A waterfall. It just disappears. And what we realize is if we could help agencies think about this data, we're not this footage as data, not just footage, right? Not just something that you watch and you review, maybe if someone complains, but really think about how can you integrate this into your workflow, right? Your supervisory workflow when you're training officers, really to make it data. And, I guess it's an interesting kind of, it's a story to kind of go with this. It emerged around Thanksgiving was the idea for this. I know, a weird thing, it's, Thanksgiving, you got the turkey in, you're doing all your thing, you're waiting. And my research partner, one of my best friends, Dr. Dale Willits, is also in the department. We're just kind of complaining about, rather, I was complaining that, there's all this training that police, are required, and, it feels like everyone's trying to sell them training. We'll train you on this, and we've got this new training over here. And yet when you ask, what's the efficacy or the effectiveness of that training? Does it change how an officer approaches interactions? We don't have a lot of evidence around that. And when you think about, in some larger departments, they might spend $1 million, $2 million to buy kind of a bucket of training. And you go, does it actually work? And we started just talking more about this idea. And I said, I've got a bunch of agencies that I've worked with over the years that would be interested in working. I really put in the arduous task of saying, we're going to make something of this footage. We're gonna make it data, and we're gonna use it. And he just said, why don't you just do it? Right? Why don't we do it? Why don't we just create this thing? And WSU had what was called the grand challenges, right? This idea that, we can solve big issues, right? And these are really lofty, right? Inequity, right? How do you solve inequity, right? Climate change, nuclear, they're really big, these grand, if you're gonna go big, right? Grand challenges. And we said, we could do it. And we were one of the few faculty to win one of these awards, and essentially it funded the creation of the lab. We started working with industry partners. And the next thing we know, we had a full lab. Next thing we knew, fast forward, I think we're maybe 4 or 5 years now we've had the lab. We have 6 police departments that we work with. And it all, started around, a typical conversation at Thanksgiving around what if we could answer some of these complex questions, if we could, help agencies really use this data, because that's what it is. So that little nudge was all it took. So I tell people, you can solve a lot of problems just bringing them up at Thanksgiving.
Awesome. I feel like the tryptophan and the turkey is definitely good for putting you to sleep, but also driving a little bit of those extra brain waves. So
It's those neurons firing the right way. You're talking a little bit about work, but you're not trying to, right? You've got people staring at you.
it's when you get the best ideas, for sure. All right. Well, so you kind of talked about your process of how Washington State University and you as a faculty member came to taking on this grant. I was interested in hearing a little bit of how, if any, students were involved in that process. I think the way that we came across your office or your lab was through a think it was a Washington State news source written by students talking about how folks really wanted to see a partnership between students and WazU regarding policing and what data they can provide to change the relationship on campus. And so I was wondering if there was a connection between your work or a connection between any of that student advocacy.
Absolutely. I'm first and foremost, the lab, is really dependent on students working with us. I mean, so as of right now, work with about 130 undergraduate research assistants. It really is about, helping students, learn how to think scientifically, right? So really approaches as a research data, right? So it's not just we're observing, we're essentially coding data. We're thinking about it objectively, right? It's not how well do you think, an officer did, right? It's really about objectively, what did the officer do or not do in this interaction? And so what we tend to see in the lab is, pre-COVID, we generally had about 20 to 25 students that would be working in the lab, right? And so they take credit and we teach them the process, again, how to think about this as data. And we tend to see a split focus. We tend to see, students that, very diverse, right? So we have, of course, criminology and criminal justice students who are always interested in this. We have psych students. We've had engineering students, right? Like we get a really diverse set of students that, really their goal is really, graduate school, right? And so you get 120 hours of lab time, which is great, right? So you have students that are struggling to meet their lab hours for grad applications. It's like, you come work in the lab, you're going to get 120 hours if you do a 3-credit course. The other side is really, these are future police officers, and what they are so passionate about policing, but they also want to really learn, right? Like this is an opportunity for them to, certainly learn the research side. But you think about how many hours they're going to watch footage. There's a lot of ride-alongs, right? Like you think of how many ride-alongs can you really coordinate. It's like, you know what, come on down. And, you can get like 120 hours of ride-alongs, right? Where, you get to watch officers in a variety of situations. And, we have, different projects that are ongoing and they fluctuate, semester to semester. Always kind of comes back to use of force. We've been building a very large use of force data set. But really, again, it's involving those undergraduate students because they're the coders, right? Like we sit through and we really thought about how to build out this, this new instrument because no one had ever really there isn't one, right? There's no real validated instrument for, how do you objectively think about police interactions and break it down so you can control, everything everything that occurs, when it occurs. We had to develop a new methodology that, we actually published, which was not just thinking about it as did it occur. It was really about thinking about when did it occur, how long did it occur, and what it does is it gives you a complete timeline of interaction. And so while we're developing a new methodology, we published it, and we've got other people now that are using it when they think about these data. We have this great code book, right, that we built with our research partners and our departments. But all of this really depends on students, right? They really are part and parcel of this research, right? Like it's not our ideas. Yeah, they're there. But it's without having those undergraduate students and graduate students that work with these data that push back a little bit and go, why don't you collect this? And it's like, well, because that's a perceptions question, right? Like that's interesting, right? But it's not what we need for this data, right? Like how well you think they handled that is interesting. And we want you to give us that information, but it has to go here, right? So we actually have a note process that we use where students can put in there how well, we look at that data because then we have a really interesting measure, which we can go, how did, these coders, so we have iterated reliability. So you have, multiple coders all watching the same video independently and you compare everything to see, how consistent they are, or kind of aligned they are. But that's their perception data, which we keep completely separate from objectively what occurred or did not occur.